Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us out on the tundra on the shore of Western Hudson Bay. We are so excited to again be here live with you, surrounded by polar bears. So welcome to our polar bear living room. If folks can hear me, let me know in the chat box if you can hear me okay or if there's any issues. We are in Buggy Land right now, so we are about 30 kilometers east of Churchill, Manitoba in Canada, and we have internet streaming to our mobile broadcast studio, Buggy One, on which is mounted a polar bear cam, the Tundra Buggy polar bear cam. We also have a couple other cams in the area. We've got our Lodge North and Lodge South. So the Tundra Buggy Lodge sits out here in October, November and welcomes guests throughout polar bear season. We dock up to the lodge at night to eat dinner and chat with folks, and it's right on an area we call Polar Bear Point. So there's great polar bear viewing, hence why we put 2 polar bear cams there. So some of you folks have been watching some really great bear activity in the last few days. We have 2 of our friends, 2 big males have been hanging out with us at the lodge for the last few nights. Pretty cool. One is an old friend of some of you. We believe it's Victor. And we think it's Victor because he has a very distinct V-shaped scar on his nose. Now, it can be hard to tell polar bears apart out here sometimes. Really, we can only tell them apart when they have very distinguishable markings. So it's tougher than your brown bears. Many of them do look the same out here, but with the big adult males who fight for mates in the spring, they sometimes get pretty obvious scarring, and so that's how we kind of see who's who around the area. It can be quite hard to tell females and young males apart sometimes, so we look for clues like urine stains or, well, yeah, that's a big one. Urine stains is one way, but it means you have to get up very close, which can be quite difficult. Another bear, so the other bear that Victor has been hanging out with, they're buddies. We don't know if they've been long-term buddies or they just struck up the friendship this fall, which is pretty cool. He is being affectionately called Capone by some of the buggy drivers out here. So he, if you get a look at his face, which maybe we will in the next few days, he's got a scar kind of running from the high up above his left eye, kind of diagonally over lower to his right eye. So kind of across his forehead. And that's a bit of an obvious clue, but it's not quite as striking as a scar as Victor's, so you have to get a good look at him. But yeah, we're calling him Capone. So Capone and Victor hanging out. They're still should be by Lodge South. It seems to be their favorite hangout spot. They were sparring this morning, play fighting, and they just really haven't been that far apart in the last few days. So we'll see what the next few days bring us. Right now, we also have a couple bears just off to the right of us, a little ways away. So we are restricted where we can roam out here in Buggy Land. There are some old military trails out here, and that's what we have to stay on as buggies. So we can't just go anywhere we want to go, and that's why we can't always get right next to a polar bear, but we can hopefully get you pretty close to a polar bear. So there are a couple bears. Where are those bears, guys? Are you still seeing them? Okay. Okay. All right. So it just looks like a pile of rocks for now, but we're going to keep the cam and our eyes on it because there are 2 polar bears hiding just behind there, and they were also doing a bit of a play wrestle a few minutes ago, and we do believe that we will see them again. There's also a smaller bear. So anyway, there's polar bears around, and we're so happy to bring them to you and to talk to you about polar bears and our love for polar bears. At Polar Bears International, we are just thrilled to work with Explore.org to bring polar bears to more people around the world. So some of you who also follow us know that we usually have our very good friend and buggy driver BJ Kirschoffer with us, and he's not with us today because he had to go back into town to do something super special. And for some of you that might have seen, I believe Cloud posted a link earlier, the train is back in Churchill. Woo! How exciting! The train is back. The first train came in last night. The train has not been to this town for a year and a half, which has meant hardship for the folks here. It's been a long year and a half. They've lost money, they've lost jobs, the prices have gone up, but finally the train is back. And our Prime Minister in Canada, Justin Trudeau, was here to announce it this morning. And they announced it live over the internet, and there is a link in the chat box. And BJ was helping get the internet going for the Prime Minister of Canada. So that is pretty cool. He helped make that possible, played a role with a team of people to kind of celebrate the train. So we were pretty thrilled to send him back, even though we miss him out here. And now on the buggy, actually, we were joking, I think for the first time ever, we're Team Canada on Tundra Buggy One right now. We're all Canadians here. But Polar Bears International does have a mix of Canadian and American staff and partners and friends, so, and across Europe as well. So we work with folks all over the world, and we know that you guys are coming all over the world as well to tune in. So we're very grateful for that. So we do have one question already from Jacqueline. How do you not run over them white on white? Excellent question. You know, there are a lot of bear rocks out here, we like to call them. So rocks that are kind of white or covered in snow and look like bears. But really, we go very slow. We are only, as I mentioned earlier, we're on very specific trails, so we can't just go all over the place. So we're looking right in front of us where our wheels are going. And you know what? If you look closely at polar bears, at least with your own naked eye, it might be harder to see over camera. They're not that white. They're a little bit creamy. They almost look like a butter pat against the snow. They're kind of got a yellowish tinge to them. So you tend to be able to pick them out pretty well. If something's too white out there, we actually tend to not think it's a polar bear. It's when we see something that's got a bit of a creamy tone against the snow that we can find those bears out here. So haven't run over one yet and don't plan to, but very good question. We do try to absolutely minimize our disturbance on these bears. We only roam around a small area of this entire landscape of where the whole population lives. So if polar bears don't want to be here or they are bothered by a tundra buggy, they absolutely don't need to be anywhere near us. They can easily get out of the area and go, be far away from folks. But a lot of polar bears don't seem to mind at all. Maybe it even provides some stimulation or interest. They're very curious animals. At this time of year, they're quite bored being on land for so long. And a lot of bears just hang out, as you saw with Victor and Capone this morning. So we're pretty lucky to be here and to watch them. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Cloud, for posting that. Cool. Well, today, the theme of the show is top 10 favorite facts about polar bears. Now, of course, we want to answer questions throughout the show, and we've got about 100 favorite facts about polar bears. But I'm joined this morning by Dr. Greg Tiemann, professor of environmental studies at York University, who's one of the world's leading experts on polar bear diets, and he just is a wealth of knowledge about polar bears, and we love chatting with Greg. Yeah, he's giving me a thumbs up. We are also, it is our lunchtime out here, so it's just after noon central in Churchill, Manitoba, so you might hear some other folks eating in the background. We have Kyron McIver is driving our buggy today. Some of you may know him as our beluga boat driver, so he's over here to say hi if anyone wants to. And then we have grad student Amy Coxedge, who's working on a radar project here with us, and then Liam O'Doherty from Taking It Global, one of our big educational partners. But Greg and I are going to kick off the show with some of our favorite polar bear facts. And Greg, maybe I'll let you start. We have a little list running. We actually had to talk back and forth quite a bit because it was hard to narrow them down. And we do they're rated not necessarily in order, I should say that. Just, they're all equally favorite facts, I think, unless you have a very, very favorite. But maybe we'll start with the first one. And Greg, I've talked for a few minutes, so maybe you want to just grab any of these and go. What's your favorite fact? One of them.
Well, I don't know if it's my favorite fact, but I would be hard-pressed to put them in order because they're all amazing facts about an amazing species. The first one on our list is the fact that polar bears are the world's largest four-legged carnivore. And that large body size, bigger than any other bear in the world, there are brown bears in Alaska that feed on salmon streams where individuals can get very large, but overall polar bears as a species are substantially larger than brown bears or black bears or panda bears or sun bears. Polar bears are the largest four-legged carnivore in the world, and that large body size is a function of the fact that they live in the marine Arctic environment. There's a general trend known as Bergman's rule that says animals tend to get larger as you move north, as you move towards the poles. And there are a number of hypotheses proposed for why that pattern has emerged over evolutionary time. But the fact that polar bears are so large is attributed to the fact that they're eating marine seals that themselves get to be quite large and quite energy rich, and that's a really nutritious and energy rich source of food for polar bears to grow to their large size, and there's a bit of a feedback mechanism. The bears are large because they get to eat a lot of energy-rich food, but they also evolve over time to be large so that they can capture that large energy-rich food. One of the polar bear's main prey sources is the bearded seal, and those, as adults, can get to be very large. Some of those bearded seal adults can exceed 300 kilos, or more than 600 pounds, and that is a very large prey to try to capture and consume. And the bear's very large body size helps it do that.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And all those calories consumed is partly because they burn so much energy. And our second favorite fact that I will also pass over to Greg, because I'm not going to let you sit down and eat lunch yet, is how far polar bears can travel. Maybe you can tell folks some facts about just how wide-ranging this species is. Their migration or movements is just incredible.
It really is. And polar bears live, of course, on the sea ice. Their primary habitat is that annual sea ice that forms every winter and then melts in the summer. And that ice is thin enough for cracks to form and seals to maintain breathing holes and haul out when they need to. And that kind of interface between the sea ice surface and the ocean, where seals are moving through that interface above and below the water, is really where polar bears are going to find their best foraging habitat. And that habitat is very flat. It's flat. It's really dynamic. The ice flows are moving around, and that kind of flat and almost featureless landscape is part of the reason that polar bears need to travel so far in a day or in a month or in a year, because their prey are distributed at very low densities, and they're constantly moving around. The habitat beneath them is moving around. That sea ice is floating around. It's very dynamic, and polar bears can't just defend a territory like other terrestrial animals might be able to do. They need to keep traveling to keep up with that moving ice and to find the prey that are constantly moving around. One of our colleagues, Andy DeRoche, was involved in a study looking at the movements of sea ice and polar bears together, and they developed kind of a fun metaphor for polar bear movement on the sea ice. It's like they're walking on a treadmill, and that polar bears can often travel a long distance, or at least walk a long distance, and with the ice moving beneath them, actually not move that far in space. Conversely, if they start walking with the sea ice that's drifting on the ocean, they can end up moving very, very quickly when you combine the speed of the bear walking with the speed of the sea ice drifting. So all of these things put together, the need to move around and find prey that's constantly shifting on this habitat that's constantly shifting, really contribute to polar bears having very, very large home ranges. That space that we call the home range is the area that a bear will occupy over the course typically of 1 year. And that area can exceed 600,000 square kilometers, which is almost the size of, well, about 60% of the size of the province of Ontario, which is a very large province in Canada indeed.
Thanks so much. Oh, they're just absolutely fascinating. And one cool study that came out this year it was Anthony Pagano et al. So his group of researchers found that the amount of energy that polar bears are burning on the sea ice is actually 1.6 times higher than we had estimated, which is pretty incredible. These bears need a lot of calories. And one also neat research project that kind of ties in here is an actual treadmill study. So Greg mentioned earlier that sea ice does act like kind of a treadmill. And as the sea ice is thinning due to climate warming, the wind is moving it around more and the bears are walking on more of this treadmill effect. So how can we find out how much energy they're burning when that's happening and how much more they might need to burn as the sea ice changes? Well, we can actually put a bear on a treadmill. So there are a couple zoo partners in the United States at the Oregon Zoo and San Diego Zoo. They have amazing research programs with their bears who are very well taken care of. And this sort of captive research is very stimulating to the bears. And what they've learned to do is get the bear on a treadmill while they're feeding it snacks. It's a fun thing the bear's doing. It's learning how to do something new and also provide us information. And they're able to measure the output of energy from a polar bear walking at a certain pace on a treadmill and then relate that back to metabolism. And the bears honestly do have fun while they're doing it. So those sorts of research studies have been really important for us to learn more about polar bears. And of course, the more we learn about them, the better that we can help them in the wild. Now, we have been watching this bear. So those of you who are watching on, if you are hearing us, you are on the Tundra Buggy cam. We are looking at a bear right now, just off to our right on this cam. And it has been digging around while you've been watching it. And now it's about to kind of sit next to it and keep digging. So what it's probably doing is digging through a bed of kelp or seaweed. And we do see a lot of that in this area. So a lot of kelp and seaweed washes up on shore. And many of you have seen polar bears digging in the kelp and eating kelp around here. And of course, as we've mentioned, polar bears rely on marine mammal blubber for survival. But, they're still a bear and there's not a lot of marine mammal on land. In fact, there's none. There's really nothing that these bears want to eat necessarily. There's no seals on land. There's no carcasses around here right now. They're hungry. They want to fill their bellies and their mouths, so they're going to eat the seaweed. Now, it's possible there are some minerals, vitamins in the seaweed. Probably feels good to have a full belly, even if it's not exactly your number one choice of stuff. We are interested in learning more about any nutritional value of seaweed in the future. But one thing we know for sure is seaweed is not providing calories to the extent that bears are gaining weight off of it. But, it's something to do. Just like we would munch on some popcorn or something at home, even though we can't live our entire lives eating popcorn. But it's neat to see them digging around. Sometimes it seems like they find maybe an extra good bit or something. And they also sleep in the seaweed, so they'll make kind of day beds. They'll find a good spot. So I'm sure we'll see more of that later this fall too, as they relax and hang out and conserve their energy until that sea ice comes back in the next few weeks, hopefully. Okay. Our next favorite fact, and this also has to do with polar bears moving around, and it's not really necessarily one fact, it's just kind of one of my favorite facts is that their feet are completely amazing. I love polar bear feet, and I think a lot of you do too. So polar bear feet they're massive. I mean, they're just so big, especially those big males we were seeing this morning, huge feet. Now, this helps them distribute their weight on the sea ice, so even a really heavy bear can actually walk on pretty thin sea ice, all things considered, as it's spreading its heavy weight over these massive paws. Their feet also have these little sticky bumps on the bottom called papillae, and they kind of act like a winter tire does on ice. So they kind of grip the ice while they walk, which is pretty cool. And they have smelly feet sometimes of the year. So when females are ready to mate in the spring, they can release a pheromone scent into their footprints. And this is one way that males can find females out on the sea ice. If you think about the massive areas that they travel, as Greg was talking about, and then you think of sea ice breaking up and moving around and drifting, you can imagine it would be really hard to try to find someone else out on that ice. So by having a scent trail laid down in the feet, it helps. And males will follow the footprints of females for potentially days to try to find a mate out in what seems like the middle of nowhere, even though it's home sweet home to these polar bears. So feet are pretty darn cool. And I mentioned before that the males will smell these footprints, which leads us to our next favorite fact, is just about how polar bears have incredible olfactory orientation. So they navigate by their nose. They have a incredible sense of smell. It's really neat. I don't know if there's specific things you want to talk to about that. He's looking up something. There was a study out a couple years ago that kind of showed that when the winds are good, Polar bears like to walk perpendicular to the winds. So if the wind is coming from the north, polar bears are going to be walking either to the east or west. And this helps them get as many kind of streams of air, if you can imagine it like that, as they're walking. And once they pick up something good in the wind, then they could move up. Then they would move north up that wind channel. And this kind of maximizes potentially the amount of smells they're able to collect in their nose and then help them choose where they want to go. Now, some folks used to think maybe polar bears could smell 30 kilometers away or something. You know, maybe if it was a massive rotting whale carcass and the wind was just right, it's more likely that they can smell maybe up to about 1 kilometer away or something with decent wind. If you think about if polar bears were able to smell every little thing within a 30-kilometer radius, they might get a little overwhelmed. It might be hard to choose exactly where to go. But they do have an absolutely fantastic sense of smell that helps them kind of navigate. Probably there's a lot of communication going on out here by smell that humans can't quite pick up on. Hard to say. Is there anything you want to add, Greg? Yeah, he does.
Sure, yes. And we probably shouldn't be surprised as a bear, as a relative of the canids, that dogs basically that we recognize as really sensitive smellers and olfactory hunters. Polar bears also rely on their sense of smell, as Elisa was mentioning, to find mates. The sea ice landscape is vast and it's flat, and it can be difficult for bears to find each other and to breed. And we see evidence of how polar bears will respond to their olfactory landscape, their smellscape, for lack of a better word, when we track polar bears from a helicopter. Very often when we're working on the sea ice to find bears, we won't necessarily see the bear first, but we'll find the tracks of the bear in the snow, and we'll follow those tracks, and they can travel great distances in straight lines until they abruptly change direction, and you can often see them change direction in response to the location of a breeding female. So the landscape, the habitat that polar bears inhabit is really more complex than it looks. It looks like this flat, featureless landscape, but there's actually quite a lot going on. The sea ice, of course, is moving beneath them, but a whole suite, a whole landscape of smells is swirling around in front of them. And they're using those smells to navigate at different times of the day and in different wind conditions. When the wind is very high and it's really blowing, it becomes hard for polar bears to pick up smells. And so they'll often just try to travel with the wind. They'll just start walking downwind. But then when that wind eases up and is providing a little bit more information, that's when they'll start cutting through that wind, walking crosswind, so that they can really survey a huge area. They're sensing what's in the environment around them, not just based on where they're seeing, but based on a vast area of what they can smell. What's next? What's our next?
Okay, so we have covered 4 facts so far, and next we're going to get into some fun facts that kind of have to do overall with moms and cubs. So one cool fact about polar bears is that they exhibit delayed implantation. Delayed implantation is a really neat, I don't know if you call it a trick or just an adaptation, that makes, it's the only situation where maybe someone can be a little bit pregnant. So polar bears mate in the spring, and if a zygote is fertilized, so if there is a zygote in there, it doesn't actually implant yet. So the female's not technically pregnant. It hangs out. Greg can follow up on this with more technical details if needed, but the female will try to then gain as much weight as possible. So she's going to eat a lot, put on a ton of body fat in that spring. She's going to come on shore when the ice breaks up in the summer in this region, and she's going to hang out for a couple months on land. Now, come fall, that's when it's time to enter the den. And at that point, if her body is in good enough condition, and she's fat enough to sustain a pregnancy, that is when we'll see the actual implantation of that zygote, and then she will technically be pregnant and she will enter that den. So it's kind of cool that they can almost put it off in a way and just adjust by how the body's doing. It can save some energy. I mean, there's no point trying to have your body go through a pregnancy and try to give birth if you just don't have the amount of body fat that you need to sustain your cubs, because you're going to be taking, really good care of them and not eating for a while. So you need to be fat and healthy as you can before you enter that den. In this area, the smallest female that we know that gave birth successfully was about 420 pounds. So we think that's probably about the lower limit for female polar bears to give birth. But hopefully the female would be much fatter than that. So we see pretty fat females when they are pregnant. If there's anything else? Greg's good. Great. Okay. I nailed that one. So we are going to move on to interrelated facts. So the next fun fact that's very related to that is that once that female enters the den in the fall, she's not going to come out until about March, late February, early March. Now, if you do the math, in this population, this female would have come off the shore in about July. So she would be on land in about July, maybe late June, maybe mid-July. And she's not going to get back out on the sea ice to really hunt until March. Now, that is just crazy. They can go in this population up to 8 months without eating any food. Can you imagine that sort of extended fast? It is absolutely mind-blowing. So another main reason why they need to be so fat and quite healthy when they do enter their den, because they will be going so long without food. They do enter a somewhat hibernation state when they are in their den. Their metabolism does slow a little bit, which does help conserve some energy. But, then they're giving birth and they're taking care of these cubs. And then when they bring their little cubs out onto the sea ice, they need to eat as soon as possible. And the den emergence of these moms, so when they come out of the den with the cubs and head to the sea ice, it's roughly timed with when the seals are pupping. So ideally, when mom gets back on ice with her young cubs, there will be an abundance of naive and easy to eat fat seal pups so that she can hoover up as many seal pups as easily as possible, gain some of that weight back, get her cubs in good shape, and they can keep on rolling and gain weight until they're back on land in the summer a couple months later. Pretty incredible stuff. So I just mentioned polar bear cubs, so I think it's time for a polar bear cub fact. I think we're overdue for a polar bear cub fact. Polar bears, you've seen them out here. They are huge. We talked earlier about how they are the world's largest four-legged carnivore. Some folks like to call them even a lipivore because they're so fat-focused. But when they are born, polar bear cubs are only about a pound or a pound and a half. They are so tiny when they're born. It is just incredible how quickly they end up growing. So part of the reason that they're so small is just to, it makes it easy on mom. You're more likely to have a successful birth if your babies are quite small coming out, but then they do grow super rapidly. And this is somewhat due, or largely due, in fact, to the fatty milk that polar bear moms give their cubs. So it is about 33% or so fat when the cubs are born. So it would be like drinking whipping cream, basically. So that's going to help these cubs grow quickly. So when cubs are born, they're, like I said, about a pound and a half. And then by the time they leave their den 2 or 3 months later, they can be between, 20 and 30 pounds, maybe a little less, maybe slightly more if it's a single cub who's very well spoiled. But imagine growing 20 times your body weight in the first few months of life. If that was a human child, you could have a 7-pound baby be 140 pounds by the time they're 3 or 4 months old, which would be absolutely insane. But that's what works for polar bears, and that's what helps keep them going, is growing quickly and drinking that fatty milk. Now, as the cubs do grow up, the fat content of mom's milk will go down, but there still remains, a lot of nutrition in there. And as the cubs grow older, the more and more seal they will be eating, the more other foods they'll be eating until they're weaned at about 2.5 years old. And that's when they'll go out on their own. They become known as subadults, kind of like the teenagers of bears. And then at about 5 years old, they become known as adults. So pretty crazy with mom for about 2.5 years.
And what makes really that possible for an animal that's only about a pound to survive when the outside temperature is as low as minus 40 degrees is the den. Like the den becomes the new womb when that cub is born. And part of the reason that the period of pregnancy is so short and polar bear cubs are born in such a small and undeveloped state is because it's really difficult for mom to pass really high energy substances, specifically fat, across the placenta. And so mammals in general aren't born with very much fat on their body, because that fat has a really hard time getting from the mom to the fetus. And it's much easier for that offspring to incorporate fat and to grow based on fat when it's ingesting milk rather than when it's growing inside the mom. So that brief period of pregnancy and birth at a really undeveloped state is a really efficient way for polar bears to grow their cubs quickly, and to have those cubs accumulate a big body mass and a layer of fat that they themselves can use when the food becomes less available. So polar bears really are using, and we could say Arctic animals, Arctic mammals at least in general, really do use fat as an energetic currency up in the Arctic. It's intensely valuable because it's rich in energy. It's portable. It's in the fact that they can mammals can carry quite a substantial amount of fat on their bodies efficiently and move around with it. It's transferable in the sense that it can be easily transferred from mom to offspring in the milk, and it's multifunctional. Fat serves many different purposes in Arctic mammals. For instance, in polar bears, fat is used primarily as an energy source. But if we look at Arctic marine mammals, like ring seals or beluga whales, those animals are using fat as an insulator. And that's a really important part of the polar bear's biology, is that they're using fat as an energy store, but not as an insulator. So ring seals and beluga whales, those animals are using fat both as an energy source, as a place to store excess energy, and as a place to provide insulation. Polar bears use hair to keep themselves warm because they spend, even though they are kind of a marine mammal in that they live based on the marine ecosystem, they spend most of their time out of the water. And so they use hair to keep themselves warm. And hair is a very efficient insulator in the air, and it's not a very good insulator in the water. And so because seals and whales spend most of their time in the water, they're not going to use their hair, even though seals, of course, do have a thick coat. That coat is made of very flat and dense hairs that basically just flatten out and get out of the way and don't interfere with swimming. And those seals instead will rely on blubber to keep themselves warm. And that seal blubber is our next fun polar bear fact, in that polar bears rely on that blubber from marine mammals as their primary food source. If you let polar bears eat whatever they want, an experiment was done many years ago where bears were fed different parts of a seal. They will eat about 80% of their diet just blubber. We often see seals, when we work on polar bears on the sea ice, we'll see seals that have been killed by polar bears where just the blubber has been consumed, and quite a lot, if not all of the meat, is still on that seal carcass. A good part of the blubber may even be left over as well. But polar bears will preferentially eat blubber because it's easily digestible with a more than 90% digestive efficiency. So of all of that material, all of that blubber that the bear is taking in, virtually all of it is going to be incorporated into their bodies, and very little will be excreted as poop. So it's a very efficient way of obtaining energy in the Arctic environment. And although polar bears, especially growing polar bears, will have to consume some lean tissue, some muscle, some meat, essentially, it's a little bit more expensive to digest. They're going to need an external source of water. They're going to need to drink some water in order to digest that meat. And so focusing on eating seal blubber is an important part of polar bear ecology, but it also poses some challenges in that many mammals can develop various forms of heart disease and other metabolic problems if they eat a great deal of fat in their diets. But polar bears have very quickly evolved over the last few 100,000 years. Polar bears have very quickly evolved the metabolic and genetic processes that are necessary to really cope with that very high-fat diet without suffering some of the adverse health effects that are seen in other species when they eat a very high-fat diet. So that's another great cool fact about polar bears.
Super cool. Really, really interesting stuff. So we're going to just take a couple questions, and then we're going to let you know our last couple favorite facts about polar bears before we wrap up. Okay. We have a question from Charlie Ricky. How many cubs do they have? Polar bears usually have 1 to 2 cubs at a time, once every 3 years. They can have triplets, but we see 1 to 2 cubs more often. How long can polar bears live? The males live not quite as long as the females, so males can live into their late teens, sometimes early 20s. Females would be early mid-20s, maybe a little longer than that. And then in captivity, so in a zoo, polar bears can live longer because, of course, they're much more spoiled and they have less to worry about. So the longest lived polar bear that we know of was 42 years old, and her name was Debbie, and she lived in Winnipeg, and her ashes are actually spread out on the beach where we are right now, which is really nice. Are there any den sites near the Cape Cams? So great question. The Cape Cams are out at close to the coast. So they are east of us on the coast of Hudson Bay. And that's an area where we actually see a lot of big males hanging out. So that's a known site where a lot of the big boys will be. So that means it's an area where moms do not want to be. They want to stay away from that. So we tend to see females in this region go much farther inland to have their cubs. And they'll dig their dens in the peat, in the permafrost area, often along riverbanks, but sometimes in the trees. So it's kind of cool to think of polar bears denning in the trees. There are areas in the world, of course, where they will den on the sea ice and dig in the snow, which is pretty neat. But they do like to have some privacy, usually, especially from big male polar bears when they are denning. And there's also a question about the kind of multiple dens within the larger polar bear den. Yeah, so sometimes a polar bear den will have some little kind of satellite dens, and Cloud had posted a diagram of that. And I don't know if Greg knows much about the satellite dens or things like that. But we do think that there, in some cases, that there are little chambers in one den that the cubs might move over to, or one might be where there's more maybe like fecal matter expressed or something like that. And often there would be an entrance, potentially an exit or a smaller hole. But I think it's important to remember there are different types of dens and different structures we'd see. So not all dens have these like multiple different rooms necessarily.
Yes, and I think, can we see this? Are we? No,
but it is posted.
Elisa and I are looking at the image, the diagram that's posted on the Explorer page with a main chamber where there's a mom, and then a cubs chamber where there may be some cubs stored and housed. And I think these multi-chamber dens may be a fact, kind of an artifact of as the bear kind of moves through the snowdrift, and I think she does as the season progresses. She'll start off in this area near Churchill. She'll actually start off in an earthen den that's dug down to the permafrost under some tree roots, typically in the side of in the shore of a lake or a river. And as the prevailing winds over winter deposit snow in front of that earthen den, then she just leaves that earthen den and digs a new den in the snowdrift, and she may actually move through the snowdrift as the season progresses, eventually ending up at the end of the snowdrift. And I think it's probably pretty rare that you would have mom in one part of the den and the cubs in another part of the den. The cubs, even though the den is a great insulator, the snow is a great insulator, and they're going to be quite comfortable in there, they need to keep nursing. They need to be near mom to have access to her milk and her warmth. So I think the whole family is probably together for most of the time.
And Greg, do polar bears hibernate during the polar night?
We do have some evidence that polar bears hibernate in a way during the polar night. When we put satellite collars on polar bears and then they go off onto the sea ice and spend the winter on the sea ice, feeding conditions during the depths of winter can be pretty poor. The ice is thick. The weather can be bad. There's the potential for lots of storms, and the hunting conditions can be pretty bad. And when the hunting conditions are bad, because it's dark out, because the weather is poor, polar bears of all age and sexes will frequently build a den. They'll just kind of bury themselves in the snow and basically go to sleep, it seems. And they could do that for a few days. They could do that for a few weeks. And that's certainly going to help them save a lot of energy that they would otherwise waste walking around looking for prey that really isn't there. So that's kind of a form of hibernation in that they're using the den. They're using the snow to form a den that gives them some protection from the elements and really helps them survive being inactive to save energy during a period of low resource availability. And that's basically the definition of hibernation. They don't undergo what we would maybe refer to as true hibernation like a small mammal would. Small mammals like ground squirrels and bats, of course, are true hibernators, and they'll drop their body temperature down many degrees to ambient temperature. Whatever the temperature of their surroundings is what the temperature of those small mammals will be. And polar bears, of course, don't do that, but they will potentially drop their body temperature a degree or two, and that really helps them save a significant amount of energy. So they kind of hibernate in their own polar bear way.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you so much, Greg. So we've got two more favorite facts, and we do have a polar bear kind of right under Buggy one right now. So our crew is looking down. Kyron's going to get the cam on the bear that's right up close to us, which is pretty exciting. So one really cool fact we wanted to pull out, it didn't get a lot of attention maybe when this paper came out, but it was one that Greg was directly involved in. And it has to do with how much of what polar bears kind of have in their body comes directly from sea ice. So it's another clue showing us how important the sea ice landscape is to polar bears. It's their home, it's their habitat, they need ice to survive, and some recent findings from Greg really drove that home. So the percentage of carbon in a polar bear's body, Greg.
Did you give the number?
I didn't.
Oh, okay.
I left it for you.
Yeah, so my lab worked together with some collaborators in the United Kingdom and at the University of Manitoba to do a really interesting study looking at how much of the polar bear's food, how much of the polar bear's tissues come from different sources of carbon. And as you know, polar bears live on the sea ice. When winter comes, the Arctic Ocean freezes over, and that sea ice does a number of really important things. And it's more complex than it looks. It not only just is frozen water, it's a substrate for a great deal of biological productivity. Things live on top of the ice, like polar bears. Things live under the ice, like fish and various marine invertebrates. Things also live inside the ice. At the bottom of that sea ice are a number of passages called brine channels. And inside those brine channels, there's briny water. And in that briny water are various organisms. And most importantly, from a food web perspective, is algae at the bottom of the sea ice in the last 10 or 15 centimeters closest to the water will be a potentially dense growth of ice algae. And there's two really important phases of biological growth associated with the sea ice. In early spring, starting in about March, when the sun comes back across the Arctic, and the snow maybe starts to melt or at least locally blow away, a pulse of biological productivity will happen. Even though when you look at the sea ice, it doesn't look like there's much going on, there's a great deal going on. There's a huge pulse of biological productivity from this ice algae that's embedded in the bottom of the ice. And then as that pulse proceeds through March and April and into May, then it wanes as the sea ice starts to melt and break up. And then there's another pulse of productivity that happens once the ice is melted and really gets out of the way and the sun can penetrate into the water itself. Then there's another bloom of phytoplankton growth. But it's that first bloom that's ice algae that turns out to be super important for polar bears. So our study estimated that about 86% of the carbon that's obviously a fundamental building block of biological life, 86% of the carbon in a polar bear will come from that ice algae production. And that has some pretty important implications for understanding polar bears in a warming climate. Because what we're seeing is the sea ice, that annual sea ice with those two blooms of productivity, the first one growing in the sea ice and the second one growing in the open water, that first bloom of sea ice production is the most important for polar bears. And as climate warming proceeds, we're seeing that sea ice melt earlier in the spring, and as a result, it's really squeezing, it's reducing the amount of time for that first pulse of sea ice algae, because it can't start early because it's too dark. So if it ends earlier, and it can't start earlier, it's going to be shortened. That means less biological productivity from the sea ice, and that means less nutrients available for polar bears, as well as virtually every other marine mammal in the Arctic. So sea ice is more complex than it looks, and it's more complex than a lot of researchers even appreciate, and we're still learning really important things as we look.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, sea ice is quite a special environment, and it's so important that we keep it around for a lot of reasons. One other last fun fact or interesting fact about polar bears also relates to sea ice, and it will become even more important as we see bigger changes in sea ice potentially. And this has to do with how polar bears can swim. So polar bears are excellent swimmers. They use their big front feet to propel them and their big back feet to be kind of their rudder. And they can use their body fat for a bit of buoyancy, and they can go in the water. Now, they don't tend to use swimming as a hunting tactic because seals can outswim polar bears, just like fish tend to outswim people if you're trying to catch them with your bare hands. But polar bears can swim to get from A to B. And as we've seen sea ice, especially up in the Beaufort Sea, pull away from land more and more, we're seeing bigger and bigger swims. So for example, one of the record-breaking swim that we know of, which was, we know it because of some GPS technology that tracked this bear, was back a few years ago in Alaska. So there's a paper that came out in 2011, and I believe that the swim happened in 2008. And a female polar bear swam for 9 days, 687 kilometers, which is roughly equivalent to 16 marathons. Pretty crazy. So she swam for 9 days straight. She did lose 22% of her body weight, and she also lost her 1-year-old cub. So cubs don't have the insulation nor the strength to swim that long, even though adults can sometimes. But we are kind of pushing polar bears to the edge. That was an exceptionally long swim in that way. But, I mean, it's pretty incredible to think that this bear can swim for that long in the rough, freezing cold Arctic seas. It's a pretty incredible fact about them. And they can also dive. So polar bears have been spotted diving for kelp up in Norway, in Svalbard. And they dove almost down to 14 meters below the sea, down to scavenge on the floor of the sea, which is pretty crazy. So we still have more yet to learn about polar bears diving, polar bears swimming. It's all very interesting. It just adds more pieces to the puzzle of this really incredible animal that we love so much. Pretty neat. And you guys are just getting some really great bear footage there. Yeah, we have a visitor right now, and it's a good time for me to start to wrap up because all our folks are very distracted by the polar bear right by Buggy One, and I probably am a little bit too, but we're almost at the end of the hour. So as I wrap up, I just want to say thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for joining us on Buggy One. We're going to continue to get you great polar bear views. And please join us next week